And now joining us on Book TV is Pamela Paul, the editor of the New York Times Book Review, out with her latest book. Ms. Paul, who's Bob?
Bob is my book of books, and you're right to use that pronoun to treat him like a person, because I kind of do. He's been a companion that I've kept since I was 17. In this one journal, I've written down the title of every book that I've read.
And what kind of condition is Bob in?
He's not in very good shape. I keep getting asked to bring him along for appearances, but it's a really old-fashioned, it's not a Moleskine fancy kind of journal. I bought it at a corner stationery store, and I've spilled coffee on him, so I feel like he's rotting from within, and he's started to split at the seams a little bit. The binding is starting to fray. As soon as I started talking about him, which I feel like is, I don't know, a bit of resentment on his part, perhaps.
Do you still record in him?
Oh yeah, absolutely. As soon as I finish a book. When I go away, I just got back from Australia, and so I read about 5 or 6 books when I was gone. And it's like the first thing I do when I get home is I get in there and I write down the name of every book.
And what made you begin that project?
I was essentially a failed teenage diarist. So like every young girl with writerly ambitions, I recorded my thoughts in a journal, in a diary, and it turned out that those entries were awful. I would go back and I would read them, and both the content, which was about teenage angst, like fights with my parents or with friends, and the writing was terrible. There was no sign of Anne Frank or Judy Blume or any Jo March or anything in there. They were really kind of awful to look back on. So I realized that all of the events that I recorded in there were things I wanted to forget. Whereas Bob, my book of books, that recorded what I wanted to remember, which was what I was reading when all of that other stuff was going on.
So it's date, title, author.
Yes.
Is there a
Author,
review?
title. There's no review. I know, I get asked that a lot. But what's interesting is that even though the entries are as brief as they could be, just having that list and seeing what came before and what came after brings me back immediately to that moment. I might not remember everything that was in the book. Often I don't even remember like the name of the main character, but I remember where I was when I was reading it. I remember why I chose that book. I can see the cover usually in my head. I remember buying it, and I remember how I felt when I read it. So in a way, it's become, for me at least, like this incredible aide-memoire and this really a diary that for me is more complete than I think that other diary would have been.
You have 3 children.
I do.
Have they ever seen Bob?
No. Very few people have full access to Bob. Even my husband's seen it, but he doesn't look through it regularly. He keeps what we call his blob, his big list of books, which is on his computer, which he started once we met.
From my life with Bob, not all books are as fun as expected. I was bored by Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance, hated On the Road, and I hated Catcher in the Rye even more. Why?
Oh, I feel like I'm going to get, I've already heard from many people who are upset with me for hating Ayn Rand's The Fountainhead. But I really did not like, I was a sort of classic good girl, and I did not like those protagonists who were rebelling against things. I was very much an obedient child, kind of in awe of authority. At the same time, I did like to read about some characters who were sort of going off the rails a little bit. I found that a safe way to explore those themes. But my problem with Catcher in the Rye was I just felt like he was such a spoiled brat. He was living this life in Manhattan where I longed to be, going to a private school, and I thought that he didn't appreciate it, and so I resented that.
Pamela Paul, what's your day job and what does it entail?
So I'm the editor of the New York Times Book Review, and I oversee books coverage at the New York Times, which extends from reviews in the Sunday Book Review to our daily critics, to reporting on the industry, to profiles and features. We're trying to cover really not only what the latest is in books, but also to cover the way in which books intersect with the larger culture and with the news in general.
If somebody gets the Sunday New York Times or subscribes to the book review separately, can you read just one, or do they come in a series? I mean, if you pick up one, is it like a short story of its own?
A book review?
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, I think a book review serves multiple purposes. Ideally, it's to tell you what's in the book, to give you a sense of the writing, and to offer some kind of judgment. But I also think that a book review in and of itself is a kind of art form. There is a certain writing that takes place in literary criticism that you wouldn't get in the rest of the news report or even in a feature about a book, because criticism, I think, is an art form. And so often my hope is that people aren't just looking for a book review to decide whether or not to read the book, but they're also appreciating that piece of writing in its own right. And I think, frankly, a lot of people read the book review so that they don't have to read the book, but they then can read around it and know what's in it.
Like all book review editors you write, I necessarily have to view books as something to be sifted through and sorted. Wheat separated from chaff, galleys tossed into dumpsters, unreviewed books sold to booksellers. How do you decide what you're going to review and what's going to make the Bob list?
So that's the meanest question to ask somewhere like this at the Book Expo, where everyone has all of their galleys out, their new books with such excitement and expectation. But the fact is that what we're doing at the New York Times is performing a kind of triage. Nobody has time to read all of these books. So what we see our role as editors and as critics is to sift through everything and to find the books that are truly worth people's time, and the ones that we think that people are looking to the New York Times to have a seasoned critic weigh in on and offer a perspective on. And ultimately, that really comes down to the book itself. So, you can send us a copy, wrapped in a birthday cake, covered with candy kisses, and we can have all of the publicity in the world, and there's much fanfare surrounding certain titles. But in the end, what we're doing as editors is we're looking at the book itself and seeing if it's worth it. And then for me, for my book of books, I tend to make my own book choices based on a kind of gut instinct in the moment. For me, it's about what I need intellectually, emotionally at that time. Whether it's to sate a certain kind of curiosity, if it's some kind of information I'm after, or if it's something that's sort of more of a gut level emotional tug, like the need for a sad story or the need to get deeply involved in something that feels very much apart from this time and place. So I tend to make my own decisions as soon as I close the book on the covers of the book that I'm reading, and then I sort of assess. I usually have a little short stack of books that I'm choosing from, and I see what am I really in the mood for, and that's how I pick.
Any books ever get reread?
Very rarely, because there's so many books still out there that I'm dying to read. I mean, I think that probably 70% of the books on my shelves I haven't read. But there are books that I think it's really interesting to turn back to, because so much about a book isn't really about what's in the book itself, and that's really what this book, My Life with Bob, is about. It's about the intersection between the reader and the book. It's what the reader brings to the book. And so depending on where you are in your life, you might bring something very different to a story, and you might get something very different out of that story. So the classic example that comes to mind is Anna Karenina. If you are reading Anna Karenina as a young, idealistic single person, you read it and you think, this is so romantic. Anna had to leave her husband for Vronsky, her true love, and it's sad and it's tragic, but it's also incredible. It's she needed to do that. You understand her. And then if you read it when you're a newlywed, perhaps, you would think, this is terrible. That's adultery. She's abandoning her child. Her husband didn't do anything wrong. And then if you read it later in life, I think you're a little bit more understanding. You've seen a number of things happen, whether in your own life or in the lives of your friends, and you're a little bit more compassionate and forgiving of some of her choices.
Do your books get reviewed in the New York Times?
This book is not getting reviewed in the New York Times because of the fact that I'm overseeing everything. There's really no way that I could responsibly do it without having a massive conflict of interest. My previous books have all been reviewed in the Times, and I have to say I got probably my most negative review in the New York Times for my second book, which came out in 2005, which was a really useful experience for me, frankly, as an editor, because I know what it's like to be on the other side. And as a consequence, I think I try to be very careful and respectful of writers and of the effort that it takes to write a book, and understand that, even if our critic didn't appreciate the book, to really make sure that we gave it its due and that we wrote about it accurately. And personally, when I write a review, although I'm not currently writing them given my role as editor, I've always made a point of, even in the most critical negative reviews I've written, of pointing out what the author did right and what they did well. Because you can't just go after someone like that. Writing a book is hard, and it takes a long time for most people, and sometimes people have one book in them and that's their passion, that's their project, that's a life goal for them to publish a book. And so I think you have to be cognizant of that and take it into account when writing about it.
When you go to a bookstore, New York Times bestseller is on the top of that book. How do you compile those lists, and is that a point of pride to you to see as many people as possible can put New York Times bestseller on?
Well, the actual mechanics of that is sort of the top secret Coca-Cola formula of the New York Times, because we do have our own method to take into account sales across the country and to do it independently and responsibly. So we have a team of editors who compile those, and they actually remain quite separate from the rest of the desk. And again, it's to avoid conflict of interest. We are weighing in on those books, we are making judgments on those books, but what they are doing is actually independently assessing the sales and looking at the data. So we want to make sure that there's no undue influence between those two very different tasks. But I love the fact that a New York Times bestseller is such a point of pride, that it really remains the standard for what makes a book a significant seller in this country. And it's very different from what we do, because what we're doing is criticism and judgment about the quality of the book. And there are some terrific books that become bestsellers, New York Times bestsellers, and then maybe there are some books that we either didn't review or gave a negative review to, and they still become New York Times bestsellers, because that's a reflection of people's appetites. And there are many books that are review proof, as it were, and you could say the worst thing possible about them and people will still want to read them.
Pamela Paul, what are some of the books that you're looking forward to reading this summer or this coming fall? Or what's on your bedside?
Oh, wow. Well, the book that I just opened is a book by Robert Gottlieb, who is the former editor-in-chief of Knopf and of Simon & Schuster and editor of The New Yorker. And it's an older book, but it's about Charles Dickens and his children. And Charles Dickens, had 10 children, possibly an 11th. And this is a book about what their lives were like, and about Charles Dickens as a father, which I think is really interesting. So not a new book. I can't really tell you about the new books that I'm reading because I don't want to, show our cards here in terms of our planned review coverage, but there are a lot of great books, big books coming out from big names this fall. So I think it's going to be an exciting book season. I think last year there was a lot of reticence and hesitation around the fall book season because of the election. And I think people are hoping that this year there won't be that kind of distraction. I think the news cycle obviously right now is incredibly absorbing. But at the same time, I think that readers are also looking for counter-programming and to get away from all of that, especially when so many people are so obsessively watching TV and looking at social media. I think a really good book, whether it's a history book or a novel, can provide a kind of sustenance and escape from that rapid news cycle.
Pamela Paul is the editor of the New York Times Book Review. Her most recent book, My Life with Bob, Flawed Heroine Keeps Book of Books, Plot Ensues. Book TV visited the New York Times a couple years back, and we did a profile piece on the New York Times Book Review. If you'd like to see that, go to our website, booktv.org, and type in Pamela Paul. You'll be able to watch that entire program.